So that way you can go back and look if you need to go back and look. And we'll look at the weekly question. Sharing. Okay, somebody's sharing something with us right now, music or something. Crud, where'd the question go? Dang it. All right. If I show you that, it's not the question. Let me try one more thing. I'm so sorry. Question, weekly question. Go, chapter 18, there it is. Okay, there's hope, maybe. Let's see. All right, sharing the weekly question. We'll try it one more time. There it is, but I think I got rid of the notes. So, weekly question. Compare and contrast new nationalism and new freedom programs. These are party platforms for Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in the 1912 election. So, pretty straightforward stuff. You'll look on page 327 to 329 for details on this. So this is super plain, straightforward, easy stuff. And don't Google it, okay? Just look in your book, 327 to 329. I'll be sure to mention the details of each plan. So you got to tell me what they proposed, who proposed it. I want to know which plan is whose, and what the plans included. And also, it would probably be smart for you to mention who won the election and if they enacted their plan. I think that's probably a good idea. All right, so let's stop sharing that. All right, any comments or questions to this point? Everybody good? See if I can find the notes. Dang it, I knew I closed the notes. How did that happen? All right. All right. I think I found the notes. Let's see. You guys really don't have much to say. No questions. Everything's good. Sharing the screen. Here we go. All right, here it is. So these are the notes that have to do with the progressive era presidents. So we have three progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And we'll really talk quite a bit more about Wilson in the next chapter because he's the World War I guy. But they also talked a little bit about Wilson as they went through some of this other stuff. Not so much, but gosh, there's just a ton of stuff in this chapter in there. The progressive era is really busy, you noticed. Passed a lot of laws, that sort of thing. All right. So your first progressive president is Teddy Roosevelt. And when we say that they're progressive, what we're thinking here is that the president wants to use the power of the federal government to make change or progress in society. Sorry, I'm having all kinds of weird problems today. So if we're going to make progress in society, these presidents think that the government may have to lead that progress. So the first progressive president becomes president because he is vice president before. He's vice president for William McKinley, and he, Teddy Roosevelt, becomes pretty famous because of the Spanish-American War, as you guys are aware of, and he will gain fame and notoriety and popularity. And then the Republican Party says, hey, this guy has gained fame, notoriety, and popularity. Let's see if we can use that without giving him any power. So when you want to use somebody's fame, notoriety, and popularity, but not give them any power, you typically make them vice president because vice president doesn't do much stuff. The vice president breaks ties in the Senate. The vice president goes to funerals and foreign dignitaries. When you're Eisenhower, you send your vice president, Richard Nixon, to places where there are there's insurrection or rebellion, hoping maybe he'll get killed. Yeah, Eisenhower didn't really like Nixon very much. But in this instance, the Republican Party knew that Teddy Roosevelt would help them win an election, but they knew they also could not control his actions, you know, that he was just going to do whatever he wanted to do. and that McKinley would be more easy to control. So there we go, Roosevelt, vice president. Nobody really counted on an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz shooting the president. This is a weird time period where lots of people are getting shot and there's lots of issues with anarchists. It's a little rowdy during this time period. And some of it is just there's a whole lot of different political ideologies on the rise. We've just seen a period of intense economic growth, which isn't terribly even. And we've also had an influx of a bunch of different immigrants with a lot of different social and political backgrounds. So we're mixing all that stuff together. All right. So Leon Czolgosz shoots the president dies, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. 1901. And McKinley's elected, that election was 1900. 1900. All right. Stuff about Roosevelt. He's the first president to intervene on behalf of workers in a strike. There's going to be a coal miner strike. Roosevelt is going to strongly suggest that the miners and the mine owners come to the White House to negotiate terms. The mine owners say, like, nope, stay out of it, none of your business. We're not talking to them at all. We're just going to hire some Pinkertons or something and we'll shoot at the strikers or burn down their little camp. And Roosevelt says, nope, I'm the president. I want you to come here. And the mine owners say no. And then the president says, well, if you don't come, then I'll send the National Guard out and we'll take over your mine until the issue gets resolved. And they knew that meant they wouldn't get to make any money. So they agreed to negotiations at the White House. Roosevelt also will create national forests, national parks, conservation movement, bird preserves, all sorts of stuff. So he's known as a conservationist in a pretty big way. He probably doesn't completely fit your definition of a conservationist because he liked to hunt. He went on safari overseas and killed animals that we don't kill nowadays. So the hunting part probably would bug some of you as a conservationist, but in that era, he's considered, to be a conservationist for sure, there's no doubt. And he'll put more land into preservation and national parks than anyone had to that point. So he's pretty well known for that. He's also going to break up monopolies. His philosophy about breaking up monopolies is that you only break up the ones that are bad. So he thought the Northern Securities Company and several others were bad because they didn't treat consumers well. However, he didn't want to break up Standard Oil and some other monopolies that he thought were good because he thought those monopolies gave a good product, treated their employees fairly well, and didn't overprice their items. So he thought that the federal government should be the most fair arbiter or arbitrator between business and workers and make sure everyone got a square deal, that they were treated fairly. And he'll pass lots of consumer and worker legislation in his era to try to protect workers and consumers. These include the Interstate Commerce Act, which does what you think it does. It sets up the Interstate Commerce Commission and regulates trade between states, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and the Meat Inspection Act. Pure Food and Drug Act requires you to list the ingredients of your food and drug items, and the Meat Inspection Act does what it sounds like it does. And you see that after Roosevelt reads The Jungle, and after a lot of legislators read The Jungle, and they want to make sure there's not so much crap in their sausage or people in their lard. So neither of those things are good. Roosevelt gets a little bored being president. He's a younger dude. Excuse me, a super active dude. He likes to, explore rivers and go on safari. He's got a bunch of little kids. And he's the youngest president we ever had. He's 41 when he becomes president. I know we typically say that JFK is the youngest president, but that's because he got elected when he was 42. Roosevelt doesn't get elected. He replaces somebody when he's 41. So Roosevelt decides it's time to go. He wants to go off and kind of have a more active life. The presidency sort of weighs you down, you know, it kind of limits your free time. So he decides it's time to go. And he also decides who should replace him. He decides it should be William Howard Taft. Taft, also considered a progressive president. Foner will give him maybe a page or so in the book. Most historians don't seem to write very much about Taft. Taft has one term. By the way, I don't think I mentioned this. Roosevelt is a Republican. Taft is a Republican. So both these guys are Republicans. And usually if you pick your successor, you're going to pick somebody, of course, from the same party. Taft is not as, you know, out there, gregarious, vigorous as Roosevelt. Roosevelt, like if a newspaper reporter wanted to have an interview with him, he would take off running. And if the reporter could keep up with him, he'd give them an interview. Roosevelt also will desegregate the federal workforce, and he'll be the first president since Lincoln to meet with an African-American leader at the White House. He'll meet with Booker T. Washington and talk about jobs and education for for African-Americans. Taft will continue that desegregation, so he doesn't change that. He will also continue some of the Roosevelt policies like breaking up monopolies, but he does break up Standard Oil, which really frustrates people in Roosevelt's political circle because there was kind of an unspoken agreement that that was a good monopoly. We weren't going to break that up. Taft will put twice as much land into preservation as Roosevelt. He'll dissolve more monopolies, but he is much less popular than Roosevelt. And this messes with the Republican Party for a little while. The reason he's much less popular is Roosevelt was fun. He was interesting. He liked to give interviews. He would do random interesting things. Taft's just like an older dude. He's kind of fat. He doesn't really want to do stuff, active stuff. You know, he's not running anywhere. He's not boxing the heavyweight champion of the world like Teddy Roosevelt did. Taft just wants to do his job. Taft actually wants to be a Supreme Court justice, but Roosevelt asked him to do this, and his wife wanted to be first lady, so there he is. He's kind of stuck. I'm not saying he doesn't do a good job. He just doesn't do it with that same obvious energy that Roosevelt had. So he looks different while he's doing it. He's just not as fun. So other things about Taft. He's also willing to work with the Democrats if they will help him get what he wants. So he doesn't get as much support from the Republican Party. And the Republican Party kind of fractures, splits into a couple of different camps or ideologies during this time period, more or less conservative potentially, or more or less, really honestly, more or less progressive. Taft also, the one thing people know about Taft probably isn't true. He was a larger dude. That is true. There are pictures, so you know we know this for sure. And they were remodeling the bathroom in one of the bathrooms in the White House while he lived there, and they ended up replacing a tub with a more modern tub. And the story was that he got stuck in the tub, and that's why they had to replace it, which is probably not true. But the press didn't like him either because he's not as much fun. So everybody kind of dogs on Taft. When Taft is done with his presidency, he will become a Supreme Court justice. I did leave out the brief discussion of the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. And this is one of the things that really upsets Roosevelt. The Taft administration agrees to rent some national forest land to an oil company, an energy company, who harvest the oil. And they had wanted to do that during the Roosevelt administration, and Roosevelt told them no. So Roosevelt sees this as a betrayal, and I think it's Pinchot was the one who worked for Roosevelt. Ballinger is the Secretary of the Interior, so he manages all of the government-owned land, and Pinchot was the head of the Forestry Service. So Pinchot objects to loaning these forest land to the energy company. and he objects very publicly. When he's overruled by Ballinger and then Taft, he continues to complain very publicly. So the president asks him to stop complaining publicly or he's going to fire him. He doesn't stop, so he gets fired. And then at that point, Roosevelt says, this guy is out of control. I'm coming back because he's not doing what he's supposed to do, and I will be president again. So Teddy Roosevelt decides to run for president again in 1912. Now, the Republicans have already nominated Taft because he's the sitting president. It doesn't make sense not to nominate him. So when Roosevelt comes back, he's got to come back as either Democrat, which that's not going to happen, or he's got to develop his own party, and that's what he does. Excuse me. So Taft starts his own party, which is nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, but it's called the Progressive Party. And he gets the nickname Bull Moose Party because he's giving a campaign speech, and while he's giving the speech, he gets shot. Darn. And the shot deflects off his pocket, and he's got his speech folded up in his pocket and his glasses, and it kind of grazes him, so he's not in terrible shape, but he does get knocked down by the gunshot. So he coughs into his hand to make sure that he's not bleeding internally. He's not, so he gets up and finishes his speech. When the speech is over, the reporters ask him, how do you feel? He says, I feel as strong as a bull moose. And so nickname Bull Moose Party. All right. Do you guys have any questions about either Taft or Roosevelt at this point? I'm just going to double check in the chat to make sure. You guys are still with me? Yes? I'm looking in the chat.
Yes, we're here.
Woohoo, thanks. Okay, good job. I saw somebody post, some teacher friend post that conducting a Zoom meeting is like holding a seance right now. Like you're looking for spirits. So I don't know if all of your teachers make you tell them that you're here every once in a while, but sorry. Not conducting a seance. I can feel the spirit of John. I heard his voice. All right. So we had not really talked about the Democrat who runs, so that's what we're going to do next. And I know that I've already told you, but I'll tell you again, that you want to look on page 317, I think it is, to 319 to discuss the weekly question stuff, which is about the different party platforms, New Nationalism and New Freedom. All right, one more drink. We'll hit this hard. For the record, water. Water. It's good for you. It's what your doctor will tell you. Taft was the sitting president. He just says, I'm Taft. You know what I'm going to do. It's what I've always done. I'll keep doing it. Okay. So he really doesn't have a platform. It's just same stuff, different term. Okay. Break up monopolies, put land into conservation. And, you know, that really fits with sort of the progressive era. He's just not doing it in a very flashy way. Roosevelt, everything he does is flashy. Remember when he fought in the Spanish-American War and he took his own press corps with him? I mean, Roosevelt's a different kind of guy. Sorry, one more adjustment of the heating pad. That's good. Oh, okay, sorry. All right, so Roosevelt comes back, he goes, I'm your dude, I'm flashy, I box people, I take off running for interviews. When somebody shoots me, I get back up and finish the speech. I'm Roosevelt, darn it, pick me. So his platform is called New Nationalism, and this of course will matter for your question. And what I've got here is really general, so you want to add more detail for this, but look in your book, 317 to 319. He wants a larger, more active federal government. So he wants the size of the federal government to increase so that it can regulate and improve more agencies. So his thought is if the government doesn't lead the change won't happen. So he's going to increase the size of the federal government. He thinks that a more active federal government would protect workers, women, and children in a more fair way and continue the plan of the Square Deal. And this way there would be more people to regulate and observe and, it would just in general create an environment and a bureaucracy that would help make positive change. Woodrow Wilson says we also, as Democrats, he's the Democrat, want that positive change, but we don't think that positive change should come from the federal government. We think it should come from the state government. So he doesn't think we should increase the size of the federal government. It should stay the same. But there should be more state regulation. And you see precedent for this in the textbook, in the history. They talk about the Wisconsin idea with Robert La Follette and improvements that you see in Illinois, where you've got the creation of a railroad commission. And I think both the states have initiative referendum and recall, where voters can put legislation on the ballot, or they can take legislation out of certain codes, or they can recall a specific elected official. And you still see that from time to time. There was an attempt at a recall on the Cedar Park City Council a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and you see it from time to time. There was one year I was teaching, there was a recall election for the governor of California. That was probably the biggest recall that I've seen. But the thought that people should have more voice in their elections, you see that kind of during this time period. And Wilson's argument is it's more effective at the state level because the state has more idea what's going on. They're closer to the action. Plus, Wilson's a little more of a Southerner. He's not exactly a Southerner, but he's kind of a Southerner. Wilson had been the president of Princeton and then ran for governor for the first time in 1910. So he'd only been in politics for 2 years and then was nominated to be the president. They picked him because he's reform-minded and because he has ties to the North and the South, and because he had been a professor of government and politics, so he understood the system and certainly had some connections as president of Princeton. So he doesn't have a whole lot of political experience, really no foreign policy experience, but he has a lot of knowledge about the job. And this is the era where we like government by expert, and who would be more of an expert than a former government professor? So the way that this election goes, and the New Freedom Platform really was similar goals to the Roosevelt platform of New Nationalism, but a smaller size federal government. So smaller federal government. So, and he wants the government to behave more like a referee than a growing regulatory agency. All right, so let's talk about Wilson for a minute. So I already mentioned Wilson had been president of Princeton. Before he was president of Princeton, he was a professor at Princeton. So he was a government professor. Before he was a government professor at Princeton, he was a football coach at Princeton. And before he was a football coach at Princeton, he was a lawyer. So somewhere, he may have been the lawyer between football coach and I don't remember, but he's a lawyer very briefly. And if you read much about Wilson, it seems like he's not a lawyer for very long because it irritates him when he loses a case. So he needs a job where you always win, where you're always right. And just trust me on this. There's no job better for that than college professor. Yeah, it's the greatest job ever. Now, not as much fun during pandemic because, you got to do it online and I don't get to harass you in person, which is way more fun. But have you noticed, I don't know if you've noticed, your college professor, let's say that you get upset about your grade. I know you never would, but let's say that you do. And you decide that I'm wrong. So you email me and you say like, Serna, you're an idiot. That was the greatest answer to that weekly question that could have ever been written. I demand that you change my grade. Will that be terribly effective? If you did that to your high school teacher, would that be terribly effective? Could it potentially be effective with your high school teacher? Remembering that I taught high school. Do you think I ever at Cedar Park High School had somebody's parents call somebody like John Sloan and say like, hey, Sloan, that's Serna, she's too hard on the kids. Do you think that ever happened? Is it possible? My kid didn't do that. And if you don't give my kid a 98 instead of a 96, they're not going to go to Harvard. You think I ever heard stuff like that?
Yes, 100%.
Exactly, 100%. I even had somebody write to the superintendent one time because they didn't think I gave back papers fast enough. Like, that's cool. One time, I think I had somebody email my ACC boss and complain about me, and he didn't even answer it. He told me, he says, why are these people talking to me? Don't they know that you're right? You're the professor. I promise you that's kind of how the system works. I mean, you know, I'd probably be pretty open-minded because I was beaten down by a bunch of high school kids and parents. And I'm not saying that your college professors won't be open-minded. I think most of them are and will be, but I will suggest to you we don't necessarily have to be because it's a weird job. So the reason I bring this up is not to like say, haha, I can flunk you, which is not certainly my goal. But the reason I bring it up is this is Wilson's entire adult life in academia, which is a great place to be. You learn a lot of stuff. It's fun. And you remember too, this is an era, excuse me, where we believe in government by experts. So who, again, is more expert at government than a government professor? However, no one's challenged Woodrow Wilson's way of thinking in a very long time because he'd either been a professor or he'd been the college president in an era where that wasn't as much a political job as it is now, and you're not as concerned about the football team winning and that sort of thing. So Wilson had placed himself in positions of authority and positions of employment where really no one questioned him, and he really didn't have to compromise. Now, because, you know, for his living, he gave lectures, he's going to be a really good public speaker, probably, maybe. I know some of us are probably terrible at lecturing, and I have moments where I probably am as well. But Wilson apparently really comfortable giving a speech. We'll find out later on he's got like a speech with 14 points. It's a lot of points in the speech. So Wilson, he's always right. Here's some other things about Wilson. Because he's from the South, he is from Atlanta, Georgia. He's from the Atlanta, Georgia area. And he's old enough to remember the Civil War. His parents ran a Civil War Confederate Army hospital and were definitely, you know, much more sympathetic to the South than the North. He also might be racist. Now, I already told you today you can't just say some historical person's racist without suggesting a few things they did that would prove that point. So here's what I'm going to suggest to you that might help prove my point. You know how I'd mentioned that Roosevelt and Taft desegregated the federal workforce? Wilson resegregated. So he brought segregation back when the two previous presidents had taken it away. He also, the states' rights thing, it's kind of a Southern thing. So, and you know, it kind of harkens back to the idea of who gets to control slavery, or in this instance, the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The other big clue, kind of combined clue here that he might have had some issues with race, is he wrote a history book that was quoted in a movie called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation's it's the first full-length silent movie, and it talks about how the KKK came into the South to really restore order and dignity, and it really kind of redeemed the South. So the KKK as an institution was a positive good for the South. And the quotes that they use in this movie that are from a Wilson history talk about how the Black South was crushing the white South during Reconstruction. I think the quote directly was that the white South was crushed under the heel of the Black South. So African Americans during the period of Reconstruction were discriminating against and harming white citizens. So the KKK was just kind of restoring things to its natural order, is what the movie is going to argue. And then at the end of the arc of the movie, there's Wilson quotes kind of interspersed on the screen, silent movie, so there's writing on there. So they have quotes from a Wilson history. And then at the end, they have Jesus floating over the Klan and all the main characters kind of blessing them. So when they screened this movie, one of the first showings of this movie was at the White House with Woodrow Wilson. I'm going to suggest to you that those are things that suggest he might have been racist. There are many other things you could read about that would suggest it even more strongly. Wilson, I'm not going to suggest like racism is the only thing. It's not the only thing you should think about with Wilson. And this gets tricky. I know that this gets tricky because we really want all of these people to be good and moral and above the prejudices of their time period. And oftentimes they're good and moral in some ways, but not above the prejudices of their time period. I think you'll be okay-ish with Wilson's foreign policy. You certainly will be fine with the amendments that he supports, but nobody's really fine with his racial or ethnic policy. All right. And this is also, it's leading into an era post-World War I where we're going to be like super anti-immigrant as well. So we'll just get you ready for that coming up. All right. So the next chapter we'll talk about has to do with World War I, making the world safe for democracy. So we'll kind of jump into that a little bit more next time. So let me stop the share and see if you guys have any questions. And remember, your weekly question is really specific. It's really about the platform of the elections in 1912. If I were you, this is one of those where I give you advice about how to answer the question. If I were you, I'd probably in my introduction talk a little bit about, general stuff about the election of 1912, who's running, mention there are three parties. And then in the body of your answer, talk about new nationalism and new freedom, whose ideas they were, what they proposed, how they were like, how they were different, that sort of thing. Then at the end, in the conclusion, I would definitely mention who won the election and if they carried out their policies. What you will notice is the who won the election, Woodrow Wilson. What he does looks a lot more like what Roosevelt promised, which is kind of interesting. And you'll see the size of the federal government grow during this time. All right, I feel like I'm done talking. Do you guys have any questions you would like to ask? Just forget what time we end. 3:47, we have 10 minutes, 9 minutes. You guys have a question? Oh, there's something in the chat. I'm so excited. Oh, okay. All right. I'll answer these questions. So somebody has quietly typed in a secret sort of way, how many words does our answer have to be? And this is always a tricky question. It's funny because over the weekend I was at a teacher group conference, and I'm just going to say this out loud. No disrespect to any of you at all, because everybody asked this question. They said, like, what is your least favorite question? And all the English teachers said, how long does the answer have to be? And the history teachers are like, yeah, we kind of feel the same way. So here's the short answer, which is tricky. You have to answer the entire question. Now, for some of you, and I mean, it's true, I graded your first question. I'll keep grading and get through the rest of them too. But some of you can say in a paragraph what others of you can't say in 5 paragraphs. So some of it is your writing style, you know, how concise it is. Um, you know, if you put in dates and details as you go through. So it's hard for me to suggest to you how long or how many words. Now, there were a couple of you in this class whose answers were shorter than my question, really, legitimately they were. That's no good. Yeah, you know the answer has to be longer than the question. I would say the best answers were at least a page long. And I don't know how many words that would be, but, you know, a pretty full page. But the truth is the best answers answered all parts of the question. That's, you know, I would love to give you a word count or something, but I don't have a good answer for that. Like, I don't know. I noticed I tend to be a more concise writer than most of the people that I went to school with. So sometimes in a paper that was 3 or 4 pages, I would get a higher grade than somebody that wrote 5 or 6 pages just because of how I wrote. But do whatever you need to do to get all the information in. Also, a few of you are kind of listy, like you just listed stuff, but didn't explain what it was. So make sure you explain what it is and how it goes back to the question. I know that's not the answer you wanted or a very good answer, but there you go. Okay. All right. And yeah, if you feel like you've answered the whole question, turn it in. Yeah, you're good. And it may be shorter than other people's answers. And that's just tricky. You know, we all write differently. It's true. All right. Do you have other questions? Meaning of life. Who's going to win the presidential election? Will we get a new Supreme Court justice before the election? Do you want any of those questions answered? Meaning of life. We should talk about that in a history class. I would say yes on the Supreme Court justice, by the way. I think that'll happen pretty quickly. Could be wrong. I'd say, yeah, a meaning of life. Study history and understand how it impacts the future. I have no idea if that's the meaning of life. Oh, I'm still, somebody go like, do you really want this recorded? All right, I will stop recording then.